Hello, everyone, and welcome to the course of U.S. history. My name is Mr. Samuelson. Last time we were together, we looked at the culture of the middle colonies, particularly a focus on how those colonists survived. Today, we're taking a turn south and looking at the culture of the southern colonies. And in this lesson, we're going to take a fairly shallow dive into the American system of slavery. Let's begin, though, by talking about this broader white culture. In the southern colonies, there was not much diversity when it came to both economics and demographics. The settlers within the southern colonies largely worked in farming. There was not much else going on in the South. And almost all of them were of English descent. Again, here talking about the white settlers of the region. We'll talk about our non-white settlers in a moment. But we're largely here talking about English with a good mix of Scottish as well. Outside of Maryland, we see that most settlers are also Anglicans. Remember, Maryland was settled by Lord Baltimore as this Catholic refuge, and there wind up being a good number of Catholics in Maryland. But outside of Maryland, we're largely looking at Anglicans. So a bunch of white English Anglicans living in the South. Now, Southern farming was cash crop farming. They didn't do a whole lot of just basic subsistence farming, although they certainly did do some of that because you have to survive. People need food to eat. But they raised crops to sell in a world market. Largely, they raised tobacco, which was very popular in Europe and killing a lot of Europeans then as now. Indigo, which was great for creating a nice dye, which you could use to color clothing or whatever it is that you wanted to color. And then you also have rice. Yes, that's a food crop, but it's also a very good one for export. So while they might have eaten some rice in the South, they were also raising it for export. Now, this idea that in the South they were all these wealthy plantations that all owned a whole bunch of slaves, well, certainly there were some of them. There were a few wealthy plantation owners, but the reality is that most of the white settlers of the region worked on small farms, or they themselves worked for those wealthy plantation owners. That wealthy class remains, as it is today, a smaller percentage of your overall population. The large plantations, the really big ones, tended to have their own docks. They weren't going to pay to transport all of their products to a city and then pay dock fees, and then they weren't going to do all that. They simply built their own docks on one of the numerous wide, slow-moving rivers of the South and loaded up their goods there. The smaller farm owners usually had to pay the larger plantation owners for the rights to use these docks if they didn't have their own. Now, plantation slavery. Plantations and those smaller farms as well relied heavily on slave labor. Certainly true that a sizable portion of the white population of the South did not own slaves, but a lot of those small farms would typically own a slave or two or three. The large plantations, however, frequently owned 100, 200, sometimes as much as 300 slaves. So this form of labor was very important to keeping those plantations running and keeping the money flowing right into the hands of those plantation owners. Now, to give you a sense of the numbers here, in 1760, there were about 250,000 slaves in the 13 colonies. In the southern colonies, so Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, we have about 4/5 of those slaves, so about 200,000 in the South. This chart here really helps us to see that. We can see the raw numbers of slaves within the colony borders, but you also see percentages. So, for example, South Carolina and Georgia, we're looking at over 60% of the overall population of the colony being slaves. So this is very important to note for the culture and economy of the South, whereas New England, in contrast, we're pretty much looking at populations of less than 5%. Rhode Island is a little bit higher in that 5 to 10 range. but not huge populations of slaves there. This map over here, the one in the background, is sometimes helpful to look at when we talk about the slave trade as a whole. And we see that there is this mass enslavement, and I do mean a huge number of enslaved persons being shipped out of Africa. Only a small number of those are heading to the United States relatively. So as horrible as the United States was in slavery, and in many ways was worse than these other regions because we kept it going longer, it's not the destination for most enslaved people. Most enslaved persons were going to the West Indies, where you would see huge percentages, 80, 90% of the population being enslaved people. Now, African slaves were particularly sought after for this type of plantation slavery because they had a couple of advantages going for them. One was they had resistance to European Old World diseases. They'd been in contact with Europeans, or at least contact with those who had been in contact with Europeans for centuries. So they shared the same germs and therefore the same resistances. But coming from a tropical, warmer region themselves, they also had a greater natural resistance to tropical diseases. So Native Americans weren't effective slaves because they had no resistance to European diseases. And then Europeans who had been indentured servants, which we briefly talked about before, that's that short-term set of contract slavery, like you will be a slave but only for 5 years. They didn't have good resistance to tropical diseases, so a lot of them died. Africans had a wonderful combination of both, wonderful in the sense that it helped to keep them alive, pretty terrible in the sense that it led to their enslavement. The Middle Passage. The transportation of slaves from Africa is one of the most inhuman things that has happened in human history. It was horrendous, and there's no way to overstate how horrible it was. Africans were treated like cargo, and not even like especially important cargo. Is really disgusting, this passage in human history and how other people were treated. Chained slaves were frequently unable to move for over a month, so they would be put onto a pallet, chained in place, and unable to move for over a month. So don't just think about, the lack of exercise and what that might be doing to you, but also think about the fact that you can't get up to use the bathroom and what that does over the period of a month. So this was really horrific and disgusting. And living in those conditions frequently meant not living. About a third of all Africans that made this trip, the Middle Passage, died of malnutrition or disease. And perhaps even more horrifyingly so is if it appeared as though you were going to die, they would stop feeding you because they didn't want to waste the food. If it appeared as though you were catching a disease, they didn't want that disease to spread. So frequently they did not wait until you were dead. They might just throw you over the side of the ship into the Atlantic Ocean for you to drown. Pretty disgusting stuff. Humans did this to other people. Now, part of why this happened is that most white Europeans at this time in history believed in racial superiority. You still have this idea out there in the world today in pockets, but thankfully it is largely fading. But the idea that one race would be naturally superior to another race, it was very popular at this time, particularly amongst white Europeans. And by doing this, they justified all kinds of things that they were doing, looking at Africans as being subhuman or uncivilized. And hey, slavery is even this good thing because it can have this civilizing benefit to the Africans. We can take these tribal, pagan people living out in the forests. Keep in mind, they weren't necessarily living in the forests. We had civilizations in West Africa before the Portuguese showed up and kind of helped all that to fall apart. But let's take that let's ignore that for a moment and just say, the civilizing benefit. We can bring religion and Christianity to these African people and save their souls. Well, no, this is just justification for uprooting and transporting people and using their labor. And no, this was a horrible way to look at things. But historically speaking, this is how some saw the system of slavery. Despite this, they felt the need to control the population, to make sure that the slaves never learned how bad they had it and were never able to do anything about that. So they created this system of slave codes, which most notably kept all Africans from owning weapons. Africans were not allowed to own weapons. They were not allowed to read, and they were not allowed to meet in groups. So without these things, with no weapons, you can have no rebellion. If you're not reading, you can't spread things, notice of a rebellion, by paper. And without meeting in groups, you can't talk about it. You can't plan. And this was all put in place to keep Africans in line and enslaved, and was by and large very successful at doing that. Next time, we're going to take a step outside of this regional colonial culture to look at democracy as a whole. And we're going to see how this idea of democracy really takes hold in England, and how it spreads in America and becomes a very popular idea. So that's coming up next time. Thank you for joining me for today's lesson in the course of U.S. history, and farewell.